Hello, and welcome to Emotional Health with Dr. Vani. I'm Vani Marshall. I'm a psychologist and counselor. I'm passionate about emotional and spiritual health. Today, I will be continuing our series on developing boundaries and codependent relationships. Now, one thing we need to know about boundaries is that no one is born with boundaries. They are developed in childhood, and that is why raising our children with healthy boundaries is so important. Unfortunately, many of us emerged into adulthood with damaged, bruised, or even non-existent boundaries. Some of us have really no sense of boundaries. Others have very rigid, strong boundaries, more like walls rather than boundaries. And some have holes in their boundaries. Poor or good boundaries depend on the kind of circumstances that we have grown up with and how we were raised, for example. When parents are not able to model healthy boundaries to their children, and when their rights are violated, and when they are forced into inappropriate roles with those around them, we tend to have poor boundaries. The children grow up with poor boundaries because they learn by example. If children are emotionally neglected or physically abandoned or neglected or abused, they will grow up and they will emerge into adulthood with non-existent boundaries. They wouldn't know what a healthy boundary even looked like or represented. If parents fail to nurture them and do not set appropriate limits and discipline, for example, if the children are allowed to do just about anything and they don't have any consequences for their actions, they can do anything and they can be destructive and they don't have consequences, then they form weak boundaries in adulthood. And due to having a void, they have difficulty forming a sense of who I am, which is called a sense of self. See, if you do not have a sense of who you are, then you won't know what is okay with you and what is not. What is appropriate behavior by your family members, your spouse, your children, your friends? What is it you would accept from them, and what is a big no-no? What if you do not know who you are? You would inevitably perhaps put yourself in an unsafe situation and accept any behavior. They can treat you any which way you like, and you would accept it. Because you don't know who you are, and you don't have a real clear identity of who you are, and along with that comes a missing self-respect, you would accept any behavior from anyone. That means you would have difficulties in placing a boundary and telling people, no, you cannot do that. You cannot speak to me that way. You cannot react to me that way. No, you cannot trash my home. No, you cannot bring certain individuals to my home. This is my safe and sacred place. Research has shown that abuse, humiliation, or shame can cause a great deal of damage to our boundaries. Also, inappropriate generational roles within family members and inappropriate roles between our family and other families can also damage boundary formation. People who have been in the role of caretaker begin to believe other people's thoughts, other people's feelings, and including other people's problems are their problems and their responsibility to fix. For example, and this is a true story, I was counseling a lady, and she was an elderly lady, and she had a grown-up son who lived with her. He would not contribute towards the household expenses, towards grocery or utilities or power, whatever. He stayed in his room. He did not have a job. And that's not the worst of it. He would bring anything and anyone into the home. He would bring individuals that were less than savory and whose behavior was highly questionable. He would bring into the house alcohol and drugs, and quite basically the house, which actually belonged to the mother, he would just slowly, through his actions, would destroy the feeling of safety and peace in the home. The mother did not know what to do about it. She was convinced that it was her job to save the son, to rescue him, to take responsibility for his lack of responsibility, to take responsibility for his unemployment, for his behavior, for his destructive behavior. And so she became not only, she was his mother, but she became his caretaker. That's what codependent people do. And yes, she was codependent on her son. So for a number of years, she suffered from high anxiety. She was depressed. When she came to see me for counseling, she was highly anxious, very depressed. She didn't know really why. She said that, she has good friends and she has a home, she has an income. But she did not understand why she was extremely anxious and did not sleep very well and was depressed. Now, usually when clients come to see me with anxiety or depression or any number of emotional health issues, I tend to want to find out how they're living. What is their circumstances? Are they feeling safe? Are they in a safe environment? Do they have safe or unsafe people in their lives? Of course, with asking her these questions, I came to find out that her situation was that she was living with an adult son that was making her feel very unsafe by his destructive behavior. So I had to advise her to no longer be responsible for him and to distance herself from him until he is responsible for himself. He wasn't 5 or 6 years old. He wasn't even a teenager. He was a grown-up adult in his 30s. And so she found it very difficult to apply boundaries because she genuinely cared about him. She genuinely loved him. But then through talking to her and counseling her, I somehow enabled her to apply boundaries, strong boundaries. She asked him to move out of the house, find a job, and become responsible. At first, it was a struggle, but eventually she pursued it. She was relentless, and she had some support through counseling to do it. And she applied very strong boundaries with him. He moved out. Eventually, because he moved out and no one else was paying his bills and no one else was providing him food or shelter, he had to find a job. And because of that, he learned slowly and painfully to be responsible for his own life. But the good news was, she, the mother, won back her safe home. She got back safety into her life. And with that, her levels of anxiety diminished quite dramatically. She was not as anxious. In fact, she was not anxious for most days. Her depression diminished dramatically. Her anxiety diminished dramatically because she took a hold of her life. She took authority over her own space, her own safety, and her own peace. In her home, safety and peace was restored. She got her home back. It wasn't trashed anymore, and she could invite her friends and other family members to come and spend wonderful evenings with her. Before, she couldn't do that. And so, caretaking damages boundaries. Codependent people sometimes can also become quite controlling. They feel that in order to fix someone, I have to control them or control the way they behave. And they become controlling. Controlling people tend to trespass other people's boundaries. And the person who's being controlled will fail to have rights to her thoughts, her privacy, or emotions. This lady, she was controlled by her child, her son. He did not allow her the freedom to her privacy, to her safety, and to just having the home the way she wants it. And so, as a result, she suffered great anxiety. She overcame codependency and overcame, in time, depression and anxiety. It has been found that how we bond with our children and how we bond with others is determined by the nature of our bond with our primary caregivers. It could be our parents. It could be foster parents, relatives, guardians, siblings. Our boundaries determine how we bond with others in a healthy way. If we have gaps in our boundaries, we become vulnerable to, dare I say this word, invasion by others. If we have gaps in our boundaries, it is because we cannot and are unable to set limits. Sometimes we just don't want to set limits. We fear rejection. We fear that if we set boundaries and if we speak up and tell our spouse or children or relatives, siblings or friends, you cannot do that, you cannot do this to me, or you cannot continue to be unsafe. If we set those boundaries, we set those limits, we feel afraid that they will reject us, that they will leave us. Yes, it is a possibility that you might be rejected by them, and it is a possibility that they might leave you or abandon you. But it is much better to have healthy boundaries than continue to live an unsafe life in an unsafe, toxic environment with a relationship that is not healthy. It's not going anywhere. So speak up. If you feel that you are in an unsafe environment and that you are not being respected, your limits are not being respected, your boundaries are not being respected, your space is not being respected, your home is not being respected, you're losing your peace, your joy, that's not the will of God. He has not given you the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And in order to achieve this, we need to have healthy boundaries. It is very important. If our boundaries are too rigid, then that's difficult. Then it's no longer a boundary, it's a wall. God doesn't want us to erect walls between ourselves and other people. Rigid boundaries don't help either. They are unhealthy. Healthy boundaries are respectful, loving, but at the same time, it focuses also on you taking care of yourself. Self-care is very important. Are you taking care of yourself? Or is your space and safety being invaded? In our next segment next week, we will continue this topic.